So now we will have the pleasure of having Sarah Skwire talking about literature and liberty. If you haven't already read pieces by Sarah Skwire, you will find, I think, 4 or 5 of them in the books that you have. Sarah, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I think okay. Yes, microphone is on? Yes, good. Okay, thank you. It's a little hard to tell from where I'm standing. Good morning. Thank you for coming. Literature and economics and liberty, I know, seems sort of like a weird combination. I give fairly frequent talks like this to audiences like this, and I often ask, particularly if it's a group of students, I'll ask them, how many econ majors are in the room, and 3/4 of the room's hands will go up, and then I say, well, how about, literature majors? And there's like one, right? It's always one, and I say hi, and I'm glad that you're here, and thank you for coming, and thanks to the rest of you for putting up with it. But I was listening to Steve's talk this morning. I was listening, honey. And it's always fun when Steve and I get to give talks together. We actually do quite a bit of written work together. It's how we got to be friends in the first place, actually, was that I was working on a paper about some poems about 17th century coinage crises, and I needed an economist to help me with some of the tricky bits. And Steve happened to be an economist I knew, and I called him and I said, hey, would you look at these weird 17th century poems about banking and coinage crises, and can we talk about them? And a paper came out of that, and a friendship came out of that, and a marriage came out of that, and now we're in Athens. So that's how that worked. But when I was listening to Steve's talk this morning, particularly to those opening 10 sort of principles or axioms of Austrian economics, I was thinking as I listened, well, this is really interesting because when you were talking, Steve, about methodology, only individuals choose. Economics is a study of the exchange behavior of individuals within institutions in a society, right? The facts of the social order are what people think they are. They're what people believe. Utility and costs are subjective. They're what we think they are. They're what we believe. And human capital, human individuals, are heterogeneous. We're all different. Steve says that's why you do Austrian economics. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, that's why I read novels, right? That's why we have theater. That's why we have poetry. Because we care about the individual choices. We care about the decisions that we make within the larger social order. Because we know that the truth about the world is what we think the truth about the world is, right? Because we know that humans are all different, and we're interested when we pick up a novel or a poem or a play in exploring those differences, in taking some time to try to imaginatively occupy the mind and the thoughts and the subjectivity of somebody who's not us, right? It's why Adam Smith says that literature is one of the best ways to learn to sympathize with others, right? To learn to understand where they're standing, right? And so despite the fact that there are usually very few literature majors in rooms like this, where I give talks like this, the connections, I think, are incredibly important and intimate, and the work that Steve does and the work that I do, whether we're working together or whether we're working separately, travel very, very close to each other. The ideas are very connected, and what I want to do today with this talk is to talk a little bit about how the ideas of liberty are expressed through literature, and why that's important. Because I think it's wrong to separate them. And I think that when we separate them, we cause ourselves all kinds of problems. There's this delightful, is there anybody? No, okay. There's this pillar directly in my eye line, and I was afraid there was somebody hiding behind it, but we're good now. So people have all kinds of explanations for why rooms like this are not filled with literature majors. Most commonly what they will tell you is that literature hates economics. Particularly literature hates free market economics, right? Because people who write literature and study literature are all communists, right? Scan the archives of any major conservative or free market periodical and you will find article after article that will tell you over and over again that the problem is that literature, writ large, the whole thing, all of it, is anti-economic, anti-entrepreneurship, it's impractical, and it's just inherently Marxist. That's just how it is. Now, as someone personally whose love for and advocacy of things like the free market, entrepreneurship, and private enterprise is equaled only by my love for and advocacy for literature, I get a little bit tired of articles like that and of arguments like that. And I'm tired of it not so much because it's really tedious to be accused of being a communist just because I have a PhD in literature, but it's because, well, these complaints are not exactly entirely wrong. They're not exactly right either, or when they're right in a very, very limited way. They pick the low-hanging literary fruit. They make the easy conclusions. They get all mad. They write an article, and that's as far as it goes. There's nothing wrong with saying that a lot of literature is anti-market, anti-commerce, anti-free enterprise. You can find plenty of it if that's what you're looking for. But it doesn't go very far to say that. It doesn't do very much work to say that. So to be clear, this isn't just the fault of the people who are writing those articles for the Wall Street Journal or the New Republic or whatever. Literature professors have brought these accusations on themselves to some extent. There's a fairly recent book called Money and the Age of Shakespeare, Essays in the New Economic Criticism, which, being a lit professor married to an economist and a Shakespeare kind of specialist, right, I picked up immediately looking for really good economic thinking about Shakespeare. And because I think that economic thinking about Shakespeare is important and interesting, and I want to find out what they had to say. But 11 of the 16 essays in this book about Shakespeare's economics are about the Merchant of Venice. Relying on the Merchant of Venice as the source for all of our thinking about what Shakespeare thought about money and markets and business and entrepreneurship would be like, I don't know, relying on Sophocles for advice about how to raise a happy family. This seems like not the way to go, right? Oedipus isn't going to tell you much about how to have a good marriage, right? Merchant of Venice isn't going to tell you a lot about how markets actually work or how they might work. Shakespeare wrote, after all, 38 plays, 154 sonnets, 2 long narrative poems, and a variety of other shorter works. Merchant is one of the shortest plays in his entire body of works. It's one small piece of the puzzle for what we might think Shakespeare thought about money and markets. It's a very, very tiny sample size. In the same way that Shakespeare's work dominated our thinking about literature in the English Renaissance in the 17th century, the novels of Charles Dickens, am I going to get a? No, I don't know. Oh, pointed at the, yeah, maybe. Yep. Okay. Is it, maybe Steve turned it, did Steve turn it off? Steve turned it off. There we go. Okay.
Let me work on it and...
Sure. Thank you. In the same way that Shakespeare's works dominate our thinking about literature in the 17th century in England, Charles Dickens dominates our thinking about literature in Victorian England, and it is the time of year, right, when economists bring out A Christmas Carol and bring out Charles Dickens for his annual kicking, right? Because Charles Dickens writes this great short novel about the evil, miserly businessman Ebenezer Scrooge and the good and virtuous Bob Cratchit. And what we are all evidently supposed to take from this, say a lot of people, is that business is evil and miserly and self-centered and horrible, and people who don't participate in it are good and pure of heart, right? And this, they tell you, is the lesson from Dickens about business and about the market. Now, the fun thing about that is that A Christmas Carol is one work by Dickens. That is the collected works of Dickens. His novels alone contain 4 million words. The Christmas Carol is about 1% of his entire output. And that's before you start counting his short stories, his book reviews, his letters, his nonfiction. So that means that when people tell you that A Christmas Carol tells you what Dickens thinks about markets and business and entrepreneurship, they're focusing again on this little tiny piece of what Dickens had to say, and they're giving it an outsized proportion of attention, right? So people then who read that criticism pick up that bias and perpetuate it, right? If all of the criticism you've ever read about Charles Dickens and markets and money focuses on A Christmas Carol, you're going to think, obviously, that Dickens and literature are biased against markets. If all of the criticism that you read about Shakespeare and money and markets takes Merchant of Venice as its jumping off point, you're going to think that Shakespeare has nothing positive to say about money and markets. And of course, the hope is, or the thinking is, that these two great minds, Shakespeare and Dickens, are morally important, are emotionally important to people, and thus they are right, and thus markets are bad. But what we have here is a failure to calculate, right? We are just not paying attention to what proportions of the works are telling us what. Now, so I'm making this point not just because it's fun to be a literature professor who picks on people about their sample size and about their bad math, but because this kind of incomplete evidence is a plague in discussions about markets and literature, and it produces nothing but problems for those of us who love both markets and literature. So the first of the problems that it produces is deduction by reduction, right? So if you Google Shakespeare and economics, you get thousands and thousands of articles about Merchant of Venice. If you Google Dickens and economics, you get thousands and thousands of articles about A Christmas Carol or about his other big business and economics novel, Hard Times, which is a criticism of the Industrial Revolution in England. For writers who are on a deadline, or for, say, economics professors who might be looking to kind of liven up a syllabus with a quick little reference to literature, this might not be such a big problem. It's not inaccurate to say that Merchant of Venice is critical of business and the market. It's not wrong to say that Christmas Carol is critical of Scrooge's approach to business. But for somebody who wants to do the work of discovering the nature of literary opinions about business or markets, it's a real problem, because the implication of these results is that these particular works, Merchant of Venice, Christmas Carol, Hard Times, are the places where the information can be found. And so everybody goes looking in the same place and finds the same things, right? I'm not sure if you can read that in the back. It's a drunk guy underneath a spotlight saying that he's looking for his car keys. And he's looking there because that's where the spotlight is, which is what's going on with literary criticism. So sometimes unanimous results means you're finding the truth. But sometimes it means that everybody's looking at the same stuff and ignoring a lot of other stuff. So take Shakespeare. My dissertation director, the University of Chicago professor Richard Skwire, wrote about Comedy of Errors that it is a world of merchants, every one of whom is honest, generous, and admirable. There's not a single lie or deception, not a single crooked, devious, or dubious monetary dealing in the play. Contracts are honored, and it is a matter of shame not to do so. Money is neither filthy nor corrupting. No one is self-conscious about it, and no one is greedy or miserly. It is taken as perfectly normal not to cheat and to expect to not be cheated. Now imagine how different the world of literary criticism would look if, when we talked about Shakespeare and money, we started with Comedy of Errors and not with Merchant of Venice, right? What would happen? Or take Dickens. Hard Times is a vicious attack on Manchester and the Industrial Revolution. Absolutely, no argument there. But Dickens' other novel, Bleak House, is just as surely about the waste of human capital that occurs when young men are not expected to engage in the world of work, when they're allowed to just be lazy aristocrats. And it's about the character-destroying qualities of debt and personal financial irresponsibility. What would our vision of Dickens' economics look like if it didn't begin and end with Scrooge? Adam Smith scholars are familiar with this challenge, of course. Are Adam Smith fans in the room? There's usually a couple. Yeah, I'm seeing, yeah, hands up. All right. So Smith scholars are familiar with this challenge because you have endless arguments with people over Smith's opinions and politics, and these arguments can depend almost entirely on whether the person has read Wealth of Nations or Theory of Moral Sentiments, or which one they've read the most recently. Right? We're all familiar with the caricatures of Smith that end up in print as a result, right? You get Smith as some sort of hyper-capitalist version of 18th century version of the worst interpretation of Ayn Rand, right? I mean, just purely out for grasping and self-interest, right? Or you get sort of Smith as this kind of, moral philosopher with no interest in the market. They're both wrong, because they're both only giving you a small part of the picture. And so solving this particular kind of problem is actually very easy. It just takes a lot of time. You have to read more, and you have to read at least both Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments in order to make serious arguments about Smith. To make serious arguments about Shakespeare instead of one particular work by Shakespeare, or to make serious arguments about Dickens instead of one particular work about Dickens, you have to read, at the very least, a representative sampling of what they're doing. And you have to stop reading the same things that everybody else is reading. The overlap among lists of best business novels, those also tend to come out a lot around this time of year, right? Top 10 business novels. The overlap is shocking. If you spend too much time with those, you could really be left with the impression that the only literary works ever written about business are Merchant of Venice, Christmas Carol, Trollope's The Way We Live Now, and Bonfire of the Vanities by Woolf. But there are enormous untapped and unanalyzed veins of literature just waiting for economically minded people to come and read them. Moby Dick, with its nuanced depiction of the market for skilled hands on whaling vessels. Richard Powell's complex and touching novel Gain, which tells you the history of a family soap company. John O'Hara's From the Terrace, which contains an engrossing debate about whether companies should focus on innovation or focus on giving their consumers a reliable product. There's Louisa May Alcott, right? And a new movie of Little Women is coming out really soon. Well, Little Women is all about young women trying to learn to control their own destinies and have economic control over their own lives, right? It's all about young women learning to enter the marketplace. Where's American Poetry and Carl Sandburg's Ode to Chicago? Elizabeth Bishop's appreciation for the beauty of the filling station. Where are Shakespeare's non-dramatic works? Another lecture that I give, and have a lot of fun giving, explores the way that Shakespeare's sonnets use economic concepts to talk about seduction. And on the way, they teach us a lot about economics and about sex. Murray Rothbard has pointed to detective fiction as a useful model for thinking about private policing. A recent novel by Lionel Shriver called The Mandibles, which I highly recommend to everybody. I made Steve read it, that's how good it is. And he read it and liked it. That novel gives us an imaginary future America in which America has defaulted on its debt, called in the gold supply, and the dollar has been replaced by a new created currency. It's well worth reading. And contemporary romance novels, just in case you think I only read the highfalutin stuff like Dickens and Shakespeare. Romance fiction, you know, the kind with the lady on the front falling over, gives us what might be the best example I've ever seen of Deirdre McCluskey's bourgeois virtues in action, in a novel called Silk is for Seduction, where this particular duke has to learn to appreciate the bourgeois virtues of the dressmaker with whom he is in love. He helps her understand and learn that her job isn't just employment, it's a vocation. And by the end of the book, they've gone into business as well as into bed together. There's far more discussion of markets and economics out there than most of us think. So why aren't we hearing more about it? Why are people still telling us that literature hates liberty and markets and all the things that we love? That's the second part of our problem. There's a kind of intellectual inertia around this question. Given the well-founded suspicions that free market and classical liberal types have about top-down proclamations from experts, right? We hate it when people tell us how the world is supposed to work. That's why we're all here, right? But given that we're so suspicious, we seem oddly trusting of literary critics who will tell us what Dickens thinks or what Shakespeare thinks. We seem willing to forget that those same critics might lack a background in economics or an understanding of classical liberal values, which means they might not see them when they're in a text. We got to go find it because we know what we're looking for. Public choice theorists, somebody back here was talking about public choice. Public choice theorists, for example, would have a field day with the opening scene of Shakespeare's play Henry V, where two churchmen persuade Henry to invade France in order to distract him from a pending ruling in Parliament that would take church lands for the crown. And we get an entire war caused because the church is trying to distract Henry from taking their money away. And things like the marriage negotiations in Burnett's novel The Shuttle should keep economic historians and property rights theorists busy for months. So we have to be willing to overcome this kind of intellectual inertia and revisit or read for the first time the texts about which everybody says the same thing in order to see if what everybody says is really true. Let's go back to The Merchant of Venice again. We all know it's anti-market, right? Everybody says it's anti-market. But in addition to its extremely negative presentation of parts of the business world, the play contains some really good economic lessons about things like diversifying your investments, the importance of avoiding the sunk cost fallacy, and, as my brother has argued elsewhere, the need for marine insurance. And how about that famous anti-industrial revolution, Hard Times? Another reading of that novel reminds us that it doesn't just contain criticism of the Industrial Revolution. It's also about a nefarious union organizer who destroys the life of an honest and good young man who declines to join the union. Maybe there's something in there we want to be interested in. Maybe there's something in there for us too. Get your information from the experts instead of from the authors and their texts, and you'll miss those things. You got to go to the text, not the people who tell you about the text. Say I as I stand up here and tell you about texts, but go read them. But the real problem with the claim that literature is anti-market is not just that people have been reading the wrong things or not enough of the right things or taking other opinions without testing them. It's that the question we're asking is the wrong one. It's trying to make literature do something that it does not do well. right? We're trying to use a good tool to do something it's not intended for. That's why this is a screwdriver. The surest way to write a bad novel, after all, is to write it because you really want to teach somebody something, right? A single lesson hammered home for pages upon pages upon pages doesn't make for a very good novel. It's not that much fun to read. Literature, particularly poetry and full-length fiction in the form of novels or dramas, thrives on subtlety and on complexity. That's because it gives the writer space to explore a range of opinions and attitudes towards a problem, as well as a set of responses and possible outcomes. I don't think anybody writes a play because they only think one thing. I think you write a play because you want to have a conversation about a thing, and you get to do that by having multiple characters tangle with the same problem. To expect a novel by any reasonably good and intelligent author to always be on message about the economic points that we like or the classical liberal virtues that we like is to expect a novel to just be a campaign speech. And that's a foolish error. So as Tyler Cowen, the economist, notes, some things actually are good versus evil. We know this. But as a general rule, we're too inclined to tell a simple good versus evil story. As a simple rule of thumb, just imagine that every time you're telling a good versus evil story, you're lowering your IQ by 10 points. So we don't want to do it, and we shouldn't expect novelists to do it either. And we shouldn't expect them to do it because art is disruptive. In whatever form it takes, and I've been talking primarily about literature today, but this is true of sculpture and painting and music and dance and you name it. Art is disruptive. It forces the observer to revisit, to readjust old ideas, to reconsider old perceptions and reformat old programming. The poet Emily Dickinson said, "If I feel as if the whole top of my head were taken off, I know it's poetry." The poet E.E. Cummings said the same thing when he wrote that his idea of poetic technique could be expressed in 15 words, which is to say, would you hit a woman with a child? No, I'd hit her with a brick. Does that translate? That's okay. So poetry is a little tough in a third, fourth, however manyth language we're on for some of you guys, and I apologize, I won't do much with it. Margaret Atwood, who you guys might have been watching Handmaid's Tale. I don't know if has that made it over here? Yeah, it's on Netflix now, so it's coming. Margaret Atwood creates that experience on the page for her readers in a poem called You Fit Into Me. And I love to use this as an example for people who are not fans of poetry for why I like poetry and what poetry does, because it is 16 words long. So I'm giving you the whole thing, not an excerpt, and it packs a punch. The poem begins, that's not it, you fit into me like a hook into an eye. A fish hook, an open eye. Boom. Art happens in that moment when the hook and eye closure becomes the fish hook and the open eye. It happens in the moment when our perceptions shift. The pointillist painting, seen from an inch away, a couple feet away, and from across the room. The contrast between two different productions of Henry V, one of which is anti-war and one of which is wholeheartedly cheering the troops on. Pop art's insistent on treating the everyday object as a work of art. Have you guys seen the furor at the moment about the guy who taped a banana to the wall and sold it for $150,000? Also subjective value. John Cage's assertion that silence is its own music. Art requires that we constantly readjust our expectations and re-examine the things that we think we know. The experience of art, then, as an audience or as a creator, trains us in flexible thinking. And flexible thinking is in itself a kind of liberty. But it's not just that sense of freedom that we have, that sense of the top of our head coming off. when we experience that aesthetic response that makes me say that art, literature, is for liberty. Like all art, literature demands that we think, but it doesn't demand that we think only one thing at once. And it gives us the liberty to express the multiplicity of our opinions. Literature, like liberty, doesn't have a lot of patience with doctrine or with ideology. Walt Whitman wrote, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." Emerson similarly observed that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency, a great soul has nothing to do. For many artists, the notion of having one fixed and final opinion on a subject is a notion that just doesn't make sense. Understanding emerges through the process of the creation of a work of art, as knowledge emerges through the interactions of a free society, or prices, Steve, emerge through the interactions of a free market. One of my favorite quotes is, "The little girl had the making of a poet in her, who, being told to be sure of her meaning before she spoke, said, 'How can I know what I think until I see what I say?' How do we know what the price of something is until we see who wants to buy it and how much they want to spend on it? We don't know. Art emerges, knowledge emerges, order emerges. And literature allows us to watch those things emerge and to realize that more than one thing can emerge at the same time. We can decide we think I love and I hate at the same time about the same person. We can celebrate the heroism of Henry V while mourning the costs of the war. Literature knows that more than one thing can be true at the same time. And that means that literature lets ideas play creatively. And it's from that sort of creative play that the greatest innovations arise. That's what Matt Ridley means when he says that you need to understand how human beings bring together their brains and enable their ideas to combine and recombine, to meet and to mate. You need to understand how ideas have sex. This is the kind of artistic and intellectual free space that was praised by Ronald Reagan, who we must remember was an actor way before he was a politician, when he said that in an atmosphere of liberty, artists and patrons are free to think the unthinkable and to create the audacious. They are free to make horrendous mistakes and glorious celebrations. That audacious creation happens everywhere, even under the worst of conditions. We see art produced in the most oppressive regimes and in the darkest prisons. Shockingly, there are even those who've taken the persistent vitality of the artistic spirit as suggesting that for the best art, maybe you need a little bit of tyranny. Have you guys heard this suggestion? Right, like the Renaissance. The Renaissance in Italy was so great and so productive for art because you had the Medici, right? And they're oppressive and it's a horrible regime, and the artist will resist it. Or they talk about the great art produced in the Soviet Union. Right? And that art is a form of resistance and it fights against it. So maybe if we really love art, we should have just a little bit of tyranny to get better art. Fellini, no great friend of liberty, argued that left on his own, free to do anything he likes, the artist ends up doing nothing at all. If there's one thing that's dangerous for an artist, it's the question of freedom, waiting for inspiration and all of that. If the artist has nothing against which to protest, says Fellini, what will spur the creative impulse? But Camus reminds us that that kind of restraint has to be self-generated. Without freedom, there is no art. Art lives only on the restraints it imposes on itself, and it dies of all others. And so we have to watch out for our literature, for our poems, for our art, and protect it from people who would impose their unacceptable constraints on our own audacious creations, whether they do it for our own good or for the good of society. Like all art, literature is born from liberty, and it gives birth to liberty in its turn. It's trivial. It's just art. But it's the most important thing we have. It's grotesque and it's beautiful. It will not save us all on its own. But without it, we can't be saved. And so if we don't do the work, if we don't find and celebrate and give platforms to the books, poems, and plays that tell our side of the story, that demonstrate the bourgeois virtues and the classical liberal virtues and the free market that we care about and that we love, if we allow other people to tell us what literature says and what art is about and what it cares about, if we accept the same old assessments of the same old sources, if we simply and weakly sort of throw up our hands and say, yes, literature is anti-market, like Sarah really likes it and we'll invite her to give a talk about it, but the rest of the English department can just go hang. We're conceding a frontier that we should never concede. We are giving up eloquent discourse and humane arguments and weighty support for our arguments that we do not need to concede. We're putting up a giant barricade on a road that can bring people to care about the things that we care about. We're telling our friends in the humanities, in literature, in art, in philosophy, in history, that liberty is not for them. We can't afford to do that. We can't afford to surrender literature or any of the humanities without a fight. And every time we do, we're increasingly rhetorically impoverished, emotionally bereft, and culturally bankrupt. It is difficult to get the news from poems, but men die every day for lack of what is found there. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions if there's time.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Thank you
for this speech. And now I'm going to ask some very it's not very known because English literature is not really very not all of the great works are translated here in Greece. Mm-hmm. Not all of Dickens' works are translated here. So there is a bit of a lack of knowledge in this field in Greece. And I wanted to ask something very, it's a detail actually, but I want your opinion about Elizabeth Gaskell.
Yes.
She is not translated in Greek. And when I read it, I said to Aris, this is a classical liberal writer.
Yeah. So Elizabeth, are you thinking of North and South in particular? Okay, so this is a great question. I'm really glad that you asked it. Elizabeth Gaskell writes at the same time as Charles Dickens. And at the same time that Dickens is writing Hard Times, which is a critique of the Industrial Revolution, Elizabeth Gaskell is writing North and South, which is a much more positive representation of the Industrial Revolution set in the same city. The really interesting thing about this is that both of these novels are published in a magazine called Household Words. This is back when novels first came out as like magazine serials, so you'd get like a chapter or two every month and you'd kind of read the novel that way. So at the same time that you would read like the first 2 or 3 chapters of Dickens' criticism of the Industrial Revolution, you'd go a couple of pages later on in the same magazine, you got the first few chapters of Elizabeth Gaskell's praise for the Industrial Revolution. And the really cool thing about this is that the person who was the editor of the magazine that published both of these novels and that chose to put the argument there was Charles Dickens, right? So, which should completely change the assumption about what Dickens thought. He at least thought it was worthwhile to have the argument, right? To have the discussion and to talk about both sides of the question, right? If he didn't, he simply could have not published it. So yeah, I think Gaskell's great. She's a great voice in support of a lot of the things that we really care about, and I think Dickens thought she was great as well. And so I'm glad you asked that because I always like to bring that up. It's kind of like kind of inside baseball, we call it, right? It's very kind of technical, geeky, academic, literary detail, but it's a good one.
Is it correct to use criticism made by people who lived in different eras in a completely different capitalism to criticize the today's system?
That's a good question. I think it's always a good idea when you're using historical texts to remember that they come out of their time. So they're always going to express values and theories about, say, capitalism, commerce, that come from their time. That doesn't mean that they can't also apply to today. So, for example, when Dickens criticizes union organizers in hard times, he's doing it in the context of the 19th century. We may find some of his observations still pertinent today. Because people stay people, no matter over the whole span of time. That's why, for example, we still read, every American high school student reads Antigone, which is that remotely the way it should be pronounced? That's how we say it. Okay, everyone reads that in the US, and it crosses time beautifully. The arguments are ancient, but because the arguments are human, they still matter. So the technical details of different economic systems may change over time, but the impact and the effect that those traits have on individual humans may be very similar, right? I'm trying to think of a good example. So restrictions on trade, as detailed in Merchant of Venice, are very different from 21st century restrictions on trade, right? It's no longer, for example, illegal for Jews to charge certain kinds of interest and engage in certain kinds of economic activities. But we can talk about those restrictions as examples of kinds of restrictions that were had and as demonstrating the effects of restrictions on trade. Does that help? Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. This was a great presentation.
Thank you.
I have 3 observations, and you can elaborate on these 3 observations. The first one, Dickens' work is full of honest businessmen,
yes.
Especially his more mature work, Mutual Friend. I think the twin brothers who I don't remember their names. I mean, it's a long time, first of all. The second observation, even in the Christmas Carol, there is a direct attack on trade restrictions.
Yes.
His discussion, which is rather awkward for the reader because it is out of place, I mean, at least for us, against restrictions on opening hours for bakeries or something like that. And the third observation is about a little-known work by Charlotte Brontë, Shirley. Shirley. In Shirley, Charlotte Brontë has as her hero a very positive hero, a businessman who fights against Luddites, against people who cannot understand the entrepreneurial risk. And her approach, I mean, for someone like Charlotte Brontë, who was not exactly a person with a tremendous experience in markets and societies and things like that, it's very interesting. And the fourth observation.
The fourth of your third observation.
Yeah, okay, yeah, it's like the Musketeers. They're actually 4. The fourth observation, right now I'm reading Trollope. Trollope is a great writer, I really love him. Yeah. But I mean, how a person like Trollope can understand markets? I mean, he's a public servant. He is against meritocracy in public administration. He thinks that, he's someone with a frame of mind which is, prohibits him from understanding what is happening in Britain, in its economy. He cannot understand technological change. He lives in, with his experiences of his father, who was someone who almost went to the death prison, like
Dickens' father.
Dickens'
right.
father. So if we saw their experiences and the limited ways that they can understand, that they could experience the changes in British society, then we can explain a lot of things. For me, it's mostly amazing that Charlotte Brontë understood, or Elizabeth Gaskell understood what is happening to persons who were rather restricted as women, as authors who lived in the English countryside or in Manchester without so much experience, very religious persons. However, they managed to understand the mechanics of a new economic system better than their men counterparts. I think that this is the interesting thing, and not so much the fact that Dickens or Trollope couldn't see what was happening in the Great Britain at the time.
Yeah,
sorry for...
No, that's okay. I think that you're right about Gaskell and Bronte in that they do often see what's going on. The Bronte sisters in general, right? A lot of their novels are about young women desperately trying to support themselves economically in a time and in a country that doesn't really allow for that, right? So given the very restricted choice sets of someone like Jane Eyre, right, who becomes a governess, or in Anne's novel, the name is escaping me, the other governess stories that these young women write, it's about this kind of restricted economic choice set, and I think you're absolutely right to make that observation. I think Dickens is much better than we give him credit for. Not better than the Brontes, that's different, but he's much better on economic issues than we give him credit for. I have a talk that you can find on YouTube about Dickens and economics that's called Not So Bleak House, that goes through several of the major Dickens novels to talk about economic content in there. He's particularly good on issues of personal financial responsibility because, as you say, his father went to debtor's prison and impoverished the entire family. And Dickens spent most of his life paying off his father's debts and supporting his brother, who was also flagrantly financially irresponsible. So he's particularly good on that. He's good on, he's vicious on public charity as opposed to private charity. So that's something we might be interested in. He's also exceptionally good in a novel called Dombey and Son, which I don't know whether you've read. He's vicious about patents. Government patents and intellectual property. So there's a lot to be found and to like in those novels.
Against bureaucracy.
Yeah. So Trollope, yes, Against Bureaucracy. Trollope is another interesting example because his novels, I agree, are not particularly interested in the economic world. I don't think that's because Trollope isn't interested in the economic world or didn't know much about it. His mother, famously, is the first woman to support herself and her family by being a professional writer in England. His father is financially irresponsible, dies young, the family is left with nothing. And when Trollope is a young boy, his mom famously finds a way to get published and support the family through her writing. Trollope famously viewed his writing as a business and was very public about it. And at a time when kind of the romantic interpretation of the author was coming to place, right? When writers were supposed to sort of gaze off into the distance romantically and wait for the muse to descend and inspire them to write. Trollope very publicly said, what I do is I get up every morning at 5 o'clock before I go to my other job, and I write from 5 o'clock until 8 o'clock, and I write 10,000 words a day. And when I hit 10,000 words, I stop. If I'm in the middle of a sentence, I stop. And I go to my other job. And if I finish a novel at 9,500 words, I start the next one before I'm done for the day. And I just, boom. This is great advice for writing a dissertation, by the way. Anybody who might be doing that, set your word count or your time limit per day and do it every day. And just Anthony Trollope your way through it. And when that became public in Trollope's autobiography, it ruined his literary reputation for a good century or two, because he had the gall to treat writing and art like it was just part of the market, right? Well, Stephen King will tell you, and John Vance will tell you, and any number of other writers will tell you that art is great, but getting a paycheck is equally great, right? Yes. So there's no shame in that, right? So it's interesting to think that there is fairly little economic content in Trollope's novels, but there's a lot of economic thinking in Trollope's life, and he actually is very aware of it. So that's kind of intriguing. Sorry, those were long answers to short questions. I'm sorry. I had too much caffeine. Anybody else? Okay.
Well, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
It's been a real privilege having you here today, Sarah, and thank you for the amazing presentation. Now, those of you who want to actually read some Sarah today, we've given you two books that both of them contain an essay by Sarah Skwire. The first one is on this book, Why Liberty? It was called in the US, Ελευθερία γιατί. And it contains an essay by Sarah about why you cannot have liberty without art. And the second one, which is also a book that we published with the partnership of the Atlas Network, Ειρήνη, Αγάπη, Ελευθερία, Peace, Love, and Liberty. And the Greek translation we've given to it is The Art of War, right? Is that the one you had in the English version? So, and this is where Sarah talks a little bit. She starts her essay with talking about Henry V. So it was mentioned during her speech. I'm sure you will find it very interesting. Thank you again. And now we're going to take a short break for 15 minutes. And we'll be back with Aristéidis Hadzis talking about the Greek Revolutionary War of 1821 and its liberal roots. And we have arranged for translation for you too. We'll have simultaneous translation. So, ευχαριστώ πολύ και τα λέμε σε 15 λεπτά.